The next type of market failure that we're going to look at is the abuse of monopoly power. Now, we have to be careful here because the existence of monopoly power is market failure, because you could probably argue that the existence of monopoly power means that it's going to be abused. But sometimes that can be a little bit trite, so you have to look at a little bit how badly is it being abused. And it has to be bad enough before we start to really care about it being market failure. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. So there's a continuum in economics where on one end we have a monopoly, and you guys probably understand what that is. And on the other end we have what we call perfect competition. Well, neither one of those ends really exists. Perfect competition is signified by the price mechanism, demand and supply, working perfectly. Well, as we've been pointing out, there's all types of market failure, so there's lots of reasons that perfect competition doesn't really exist. It's more of an idea that we talk about to compare actual businesses to. Well, likewise, monopoly, you could maybe argue that it exists more, but to say that one company has complete control over a certain industry, I think that's probably pretty easy to start to make objections to. So for example, in South Africa, many people would call Eskom a monopoly, and it's a bit pedantic, but I would point out that they're not a monopoly. I could go buy a generator and put gas in the generator and never pay Eskom any money at all. I can put solar panels on top of my roof and generate electricity that way. So yeah, Eskom is a good example. It's very close to being a monopoly, but even with it, you could make some sort of objection to saying that it's 100% monopolizes the electricity industry. The key characteristic of a monopoly is they can set the price wherever they want. In a perfect competition, if I set the price too high or too low, I'm going to be forced to change it, but that's not true in a monopoly. I put some examples here of 4 different businesses, or 5 I guess, and each one of them is closer to being a perfect competition or closer to being a monopoly. Again, Eskom, to be honest, they're probably further to the right there, because they do control almost all the electricity in South Africa. Apple and Samsung, well, neither of them are a monopoly because obviously there's the other guy, but they do have a lot of monopoly power. They can set the price rather high. Now, if Apple sets its prices too high, people are going to go to Samsung, and vice versa for Samsung. But on the other hand, there are people who would continue to buy the Apple, the iPhone, instead of a Samsung because they have so much loyalty to Apple. So that gives Apple more price-setting power. Moving to the left, closer to perfect competition, maybe a restaurant like Mug and Bean. The second I start to feel that Mug and Bean's prices are too high, I would start going to a different kind of just basic restaurant. What they offer there is not so special. Usually when I go to Mug and Bean, it's just about convenience. So they don't have the ability to set price too much. If they set it too high, they'll lose their business. How about a street vendor? The guys in the middle of the road who sell Cokes. A Coke is 10 Rand, that's all it costs. If I roll up to a guy and ask for a Coke and he asks for 15 Rand, I'm just gonna keep on going. I'm not gonna buy it because I know the price is 10 Rand and I'm not even gonna pay 11. I would just go to the next guy and he would sell it to me for 10, so that's that. So he has very little price setting power and he has to respond more to demand and supply. 3 terms we need to know. Actually 4, I guess. First is marginal cost, which we will refer to as MC. Marginal cost follows what we call the law of eventually diminishing marginal returns. We've talked about that before. If you don't remember the definition, you probably ought to go look it up. Essentially what it means here is that as I produce something more and more, it costs me more and more to produce each additional unit. So what we see with marginal costs is that because of the law of eventually diminishing marginal returns, the additional costs are always greater than the previous costs. So if it costs me $10 to produce the 5th unit of something, then it will cost me more to produce the 6th unit. So if it cost me $10 to produce the 5th, it will cost me $11 to produce the 6th. It'll cost me $12 to produce the 7th, and on and on and on. That can be difficult for people to accept. You're going to have to wait before I justify it, but there is solid evidence that that's true. Okay, so when we look at marginal costs, that's the analysis of the explanation. The definition is these are the additional costs that you incur when you choose to produce one more. Marginal revenue is a pretty easy concept once you understand this. It's the additional revenue that you get by selling one more. So by producing and then selling that additional unit, that's my marginal revenue. It's governed by the law of diminishing marginal utility, which says the more and more a market consumes of a product or an individual, the lower the price will have to be. Which is to say, if you can quantify your utility for production or consumption of a single good, maybe a donut, so that first donut you eat, it's really good, and maybe it's worth 25, 30 Rand in your mind. The next one that you eat, though, because you're already a little full, is going to be worth a little bit less, maybe only 20 Rand or something like that. So that's our idea of marginal revenue, and we refer to that as MR. Okay, our whole theory here, the abuse of monopoly power, the whole theory centers around the idea that if you have monopoly power, you can set the price higher than it should be according to demand and supply. So what's going to happen here is the price is going to be set to gain what's called profit maximization. And this is pretty easy to accept. Most businesses want to maximize the amount of profit they make. So if they can take steps to maximize it, of course they will. The theory states that profit maximization occurs when you produce at the quantity where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. So you'll see in a moment, but if we assume that marginal revenue starts at a high value, 10, and then goes down from there, and marginal cost starts at a low value, maybe $1, and goes up from there, well, what we can see is that as long as the marginal costs, 1, are less than the marginal revenue, 10, then the difference, 9, 10 minus 1, would be my profit. And that will continue to be true until some point where those intersect. So if I produce the 10th unit and my marginal cost is, say, $8, and my marginal revenue is also $8, well, my profit doesn't get any bigger. So I wouldn't produce any more from that point. The key on this that we'll see on the diagram is the price is set higher than the point where marginal costs and marginal revenue intersect. That's important because if we look at our definition for allocative efficiency, there's lots of different definitions we can use. So the approximate one that kind of works best here is when we say that allocative efficiency occurs when marginal costs are equal to the price. So the price I pay as a consumer is equal to what the additional costs to the producer were. Okay, the diagram looks like this. Again, we see marginal cost with a positive slope. That's due to the law of eventually diminishing marginal returns. So as I produce more and more and more output, costs come higher and higher and higher. So it's going to work like a supply curve. It's not the supply curve. There's a reason for that we'll talk more about when we study theory of the firm. But for now, you can kind of think about it like the supply curve. The demand curve is downward sloping, of course, it always is, and the important thing is that marginal revenue is derived from the demand curve. It's twice as steep as the demand curve. Anyway, this, as you can see, is twice as steep. There's a mathematical reason for that, or a mathematical relationship between the two that guarantees that that's always going to happen. So it's not an assumption. Anyhow. We see the point of allocative efficiency here. If we think about marginal cost to supply, and obviously demand is demand, well, where demand and supply intersect, that's going to be where we see allocative efficiency. On the diagram, what we could say is that any quantity previous to that, if we set the price where marginal cost was, say here, well, there would be, remember at that price, there would be a certain amount of excess demand, and that excess demand would drive the price up. And eventually we would arrive at this point here that I've labeled allocative efficiency. We're not going to see that if you have price setting power. Here's why. We said on the previously that profit maximization occurs if you produce at the point where marginal costs are equal to marginal revenue. So where those two intersect, what we're showing here. That says profit max. We use pi as shorthand for profit. I produce at this point, but remember, if I produce at this point and keep the price here, like I just said, there's going to be excess demand. So instead what I do is I go, okay, well here's the quantity that I've produced. What price can I charge? Well, to figure that out, I have to go look up here on the demand curve. So what this allows, it allows the producer to set a price higher than marginal cost. Therefore, by our definition, this is not allocatively efficient. Our conclusions here then, so we need to see that QPM is to the left or less than quantity at equilibrium. Therefore, we aren't allocating enough resources, or as many resources as society wants, to the production of this good. Furthermore, we're paying a higher price, PPM versus P star, than we should be as well. So not only are resources of land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship being misused, but for the consumers, their money, the money they have to buy things with, they're paying more than they should, so it's being misused as well. Okay, at the beginning of this, I said, look, just because it has monopoly power and maybe even abuses it, doesn't necessarily make it market failure. You have to ask two questions. First of all, you have to ask, how much higher is price than it should be? So we're saying, how much higher is PPM than P star in this particular case? Obviously, we don't really know, but we can sort of make some assumptions in a typical market. The further to the right on that scale they're going to be, the more likely it is that the price is going to be a good bit higher. So the further to the right, you know, if here's what P star is, the further above P star that you are, the more of an opportunity to abuse monopoly power there is, and the more of a problem that's likely to be. The second question that has to be asked is, in the market that we're looking at, how necessary is the good? Because to be honest, if we're talking about the prices of Bulgari watches, maybe those prices are much, much higher than they should be. You know, you can go pay $5,000, $10,000 for a watch, and maybe that watch should only cost a few $100s. Well, the price is much higher than it should be, but does it really matter? I mean, I don't have to wear a Bulgari watch or anything like that. I can just wear a cheaper watch like what I do wear. So it's not as if it's actually hurting society that that price is too high. So maybe it doesn't really matter that it is too high. But if it were something more crucial, if it were anything having to do with food or health services, medicine is a big one. So for example, if you look at the retroviral drugs that fight against the HIV virus and keep it under control so that the effects of HIV are reduced, those tend to be quite expensive. Well, if they're a lot more expensive than what society wants, that's a problem. And how needed is that? Well, personally, I feel like living in a world where people who have HIV don't suffer as much and live a longer, more full life, I feel like that's a good thing. Therefore, I would say that those drugs are very necessary. Therefore, that's a better example of monopoly power causing market failure than perhaps talking about a luxury item like a watch or a handbag or something like that.